April 21st, 1945, a forest clearing between Duberg and Lindorf, Germany. The air was heavy with the scent of damp pine and smoke. Field Marshal Walter Modd stood alone among the trees, his service pistol cold in his hand. Behind him lay the broken remains of Army Group B, more than 300,000 men who had laid down their arms to the advancing American forces. Before him stretched an impossible choice: surrender and betray his oath, or die a soldier of the Reich. Moments later, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the still forest. The sound marked not only the end of one man's life, but the symbolic death of German resistance in the West. The collapse that followed would baffle historians for generations. Between March and May 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to the American and Western Allied forces. Entire divisions walked through their own defensive lines, hands raised, white flags waving from bed sheets and tablecloths. They surrendered not because they lacked ammunition or leadership, but because they feared one fate above all others: capture by the Soviet Red Army. From June 1944, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, to April 30th, 1945, when Adolf Hitler ended his life in his Berlin bunker, 2.8 million German soldiers gave themselves up to the Western Allies. 1.5 million of them surrendered in April alone. During the first half of that month, 39,000 Germans surrendered every day. In the final 2 weeks, that number soared to 59,000 per day. These men still had weapons. They still held fortified positions. Yet they chose surrender because they knew what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands. Every German soldier had heard the stories. The whispers that passed through the ranks told of Stalingrad, where 91,000 men of the Sixth Army had surrendered in February 1943. Only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in captivity, starved, frozen, or worked to death in Soviet labor camps. They knew of the endless marches through the snow, of the men who collapsed along the road and were shot where they lay. They had heard of Siberia and the Euromines, where German prisoners dug, carried, and died in silence. The numbers were not rumor, they were fact. The post-war Mashka Commission would confirm that of the 3 million Germans captured by the Soviet Union, more than 1 million never returned. 1 in every 3 German prisoners perished in Soviet hands. But their fear was not only of death, it was of vengeance. Since 1941, when Operation Barbarossa had unleashed the largest invasion in human history, the German army had waged a war of annihilation. They had burned villages, executed civilians, and starved millions. Nazi ideology had declared Slavs to be subhuman, fit only for slavery or extermination. The Wehrmacht had been complicit in those crimes, whether through action or silence. The soldiers who now faced the Red Army understood what they had done, or at least what had been done in their name. They knew that the Soviets would come not merely as enemies, but as avengers. The blood of 26 million Soviet citizens cried out from the earth, and every German soldier in 1945 could hear it. The Americans were different. When German troops first faced American forces, they discovered something that defied every piece of Nazi propaganda. The Americans fought hard, yes, but they fought by rules. They took prisoners, they fed them, treated their wounds, and followed the Geneva Convention. Under General Eisenhower's orders, even in chaos, American soldiers were instructed to treat surrendering Germans humanely. Word spread quickly. Captured soldiers were often held in temporary enclosures visible from German positions. Their comrades could see them alive, unharmed, smoking cigarettes, eating. That sight was more powerful than any leaflet or broadcast. It told the truth. Surrender to the Americans meant life. And so, as April wore on, the German army in the West began to collapse, not from combat, but from choice. In the Ruhr pocket, 17,000 men surrendered in just a few days. Field Marshal Model had dissolved his command rather than formally capitulate, giving his men permission to decide for themselves. Most walked west toward the Americans, rather than east toward the Soviets. It was not cowardice. It was calculation, one born of experience, guilt, and survival. German leaders understood this too. After Hitler's death, Admiral Karl Donitz took command of the crumbling Reich. His strategy was simple. Keep fighting the Soviets, but surrender to the Western Allies. Save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. Donitz called it a partial capitulation, what historians would later describe as a desperate bid for survival. In early May 1945, his representatives tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, but General Eisenhower saw through it. He issued an ultimatum. Germany must surrender unconditionally on all fronts to all allies, or the Western armies would close their lines, forcing every remaining German to surrender to the Soviets. Faced with this, the German High Command had no choice. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the document of unconditional surrender. The following day, the Soviets demanded their own ceremony in Berlin. On May 8, the war in Europe was officially over. Yet for many German soldiers, the end had come weeks earlier when they chose to walk west instead of fight east. Their surrender had been both an act of desperation and a quiet plea for the survival of their people. On the Eastern Front, it was a different story. There the war raged until the final hour. German troops fought savagely, not for victory, but to buy time for civilians fleeing westward ahead of the Red Army. Millions of refugees, women, children, the elderly, poured across frozen fields, fleeing the vengeance they knew was coming. Soldiers died holding the line, not for Hitler, but for those civilians. The Battle of Halb, southeast of Berlin, was their last stand. 200,000 German soldiers and tens of thousands of refugees found themselves encircled by Soviet forces. Knowing what Soviet capture meant, they tried to break out westward toward American lines. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, village to village, a massacre of desperation. Only 30,000 made it through. Tens of thousands died. By contrast, in the Ruhr pocket, where Germans surrendered to Americans, over 300,000 were captured alive. The difference could not have been clearer. Surrender to the West was survival. Surrender to the East was death. The same pattern echoed everywhere. By April 1945, American and British forces were taking 60,000 prisoners a day. In the East, Germans fought to the end. The death toll tells the story. Of the 5.3 million German soldiers who died in World War, nearly 4 million perished on the Eastern Front, almost 80% of all German losses. The contrast was stark. In the West, white flags fluttered over German cities as whole garrisons surrendered without a fight. In the East, Berlin burned to ashes. Soviet troops stormed the capital street by street, block by block. Boys of the Hitler Youth and old men of the Volksarmee fought with rifles and panzerfasts until they fell. By the time the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag, nearly 100,000 Germans laid dead in the ruins. For those who survived and reached American captivity, the experience was harsh but humane. The sheer number of prisoners overwhelmed the Allies. The Rhine meadow camps, open fields fenced with barbed wire, were hastily created to hold the flood of captives. Food was short, shelter was minimal. But within months the situation improved. By summer, prisoners were transferred to permanent camps. Most were repatriated within 3 years. Out of millions, only a few thousand died, less than 1%. Those who surrendered to the Soviets endured a longer ordeal. They were sent east into the vastness of the Soviet Union to mines, factories, and construction projects. The Soviet Union, devastated by the war, used them as forced labor to build what German bombs had destroyed. Many died in the first years from hunger and exhaustion. Most of the survivors were released between 1947 and 1950. Thelest came home in 1956, 11 years after the war's end. The difference between these two fates shaped post-war Europe. The millions of men who surrendered to the Western Allies returned to a Germany that would soon rise again, rebuilt with American aid, protected by NATO, and guided toward democracy. Many of them became the foundation of the new West Germany, men who had seen both tyranny and mercy and chose to build something better. Those who turned from Soviet captivity went home to a different Germany, one ruled by Moscow, where the past could not be spoken of so freely. In the end, the mass surrender of 1945 was more than a military collapse. It was a collective act of survival and a turning point in history. The German soldiers who walked west were not merely saving their own lives. They were choosing which future their nation would have. They had learned through fear, guilt, and bitter experience that some enemies could destroy you and others could forgive you. And in that desperate spring of 1945, millions of men made the same decision to lay down their arms and walk toward life. By late April 1945, Germany was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation in collapse. The Reich still existed on paper, but its armies were shattered, its cities burned, its leader isolated in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Yet, even as the Third Reich crumbled, one final struggle remained, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of its soldiers. The struggle between surrender and annihilation. Everywhere, German forces faced the same reality. To the east, the Red Army. To the west, the Americans and British. Between them lay millions of frightened men trying to decide which enemy to face. For many, it was not a question of loyalty anymore. It was a question of survival. Admiral Karl Donitz, the man who succeeded Hitler after his suicide on April 30th, understood this better than anyone. Donitz was a career naval officer, pragmatic and calculating, and knew the war was lost. His goal was not victory, but escape. Escape for as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. He crafted what he called successive partial surrenders, a plan to keep fighting the Soviets while quietly negotiating the surrender of German forces in the West. In practice, this meant ordering troops to retreat westward at any cost. Entire divisions abandoned positions on the Eastern Front, not to defend Germany, but to reach the British or American lines before the Soviets caught them. German radio intercepts from that time are filled with the same desperate message. March west. Reach the Americans. Avoid the Russians at all costs. In late April, Donitz's government, operating from the northern port city of Flensburg, opened channels to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Therefore was simple. German forces in Denmark, the Netherlands, and northwest Germany would lay down their arms if they could surrender only to the British. Montgomery accepted. On May 4th, the surrender was signed at Lundberg Heath. It was a massive capitulation. Nearly 1 million German troops surrendered in a single day. But it was not yet the end. The Allies had made it clear that they would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender on all fronts. When General Alfred Jodl arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters in Rains 2 days later, Het tried to argue for separate peace in the West, while the fighting continued in the East. Eisenhower's response was immediate and uncompromising. If Germany did not surrender everywhere, he warned, Allied lines would be sealed. No more German soldiers would be allowed to cross west. Every man still in the field would fall into Soviet hands. It was the final blow. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender. The fighting in Europe was over. The next day in Berlin, a second ceremony was held under Soviet supervision. To the east, May the 9th would forever be remembered as Victory Day. But for the German soldiers who had walked west to surrender, the true victory was simply survival. The sheer scale of those surrenders was unprecedented. Never in modern warfare had such a vast organized military force laid down its arms voluntarily. American field commanders were astonished. Roads were clogged for miles with columns of unarmed men, infantry, tank crews, officers, even SS units marching toward captivity. Some carried white flags. Others held up makeshift signs reading, "Don't shoot, we surrender." At crossroads and riverbanks, Americans set up temporary enclosures, barbed wire pens that quickly filled with prisoners. They came faster than anyone had anticipated. In a single day, more than 100,000 German soldiers could appear along a single sector. Eisenhower's staff had planned for tens of thousands of prisoners, not millions. Supply lines strained under the weight of the human flood. Food, shelter, and transport were insufficient. The solution was improvised. Open-air camps along the Rye River known as the Rhin-Wissen-Lager, the Rye Meadow camps. Conditions in those camps were difficult. The prisoners lived under the open sky. Their only shelter the clothes on their backs or makeshift tents made from scraps of canvas. Food was rationed, medical care minimal, and sanitation poor. Yet even so, death rates remained relatively low, around 1% according to later studies. It was a harsh captivity, but not a fate alone. By contrast, those captured by the Soviets faced a very different ordeal. Their journey east began with long marches through the ruins of Eastern Europe. Hundreds of thousands were herded into railway cars bound for camps deep inside the Soviet Union. Many never reached their destinations. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion claimed thousands along the way. Those who survived were assigned to labor camps, mines, factories, construction sites, farms. The Soviet Union, devastated by the war, needed manpower to rebuild. German prisoners became an involuntary workforce. Their labor seen